we have Steve Goldstein here. He's a veteran journalist and former bureau chief in Moscow. Oh, and in Washington, D.C. Oh.
Hard to tell the difference now, right?
Yes. He's educated at Cornell University, Industrial and Labor Relations, Bachelor of Science of Labor Relations in '71, Graduate School of Journalism from Columbia University, and he's had several varied occupations here. I think you started as a reporter for the Staten Island Advance.
Yes, I did.
That sounds like a major newspaper, like the Messenger, maybe? No. He's Washington bureau chief for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Now that's a prominent paper.
Not the National Enquirer, Philadelphia.
Okay, so it's the Philadelphia Inquirer. Senior editor director of Conservation International, executive communications for Aerospace Industries, communications editor for Fogart International Center, correspondent for HealthWorks Network, HealthWorks Collective, contract writer for George Washington University, national correspondent for Inside Philanthropy, contributing writer for Bethesda magazine, and our own local 7 Days contributing writer, the most important one you've had, I'm sure. Would you please welcome Steve Goldstein.
Thank you very much, John. That is actually worthy of the KGB, that unearthing all that information. Let's get started. How many of you have been to Russia? Okay, how many of you were in the KGB? Oh, well, that's good. Now I feel much more relaxed. You will see on the screen that my name is Stepan Melvinovich. Now, I use the Russian version. Everybody in Russia is called by his or her first name and then what's known as a patronymic. Patronymic is your father's first name, with Vich at the end if you're male and Ova if you're a female. So when you addressed somebody formally, assuming you didn't know them, they weren't pals of yours, you always used the formal appellation, which was the patronymic. So I'm going to go through my experience and my family's experience in Russia and the Soviet Union, actually, Soviet Union and then Russia. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I'd prefer waiting until the end, but if it's something that can't wait, raise your hand and I'll either ignore you or call on you. But if the question is boring, that's it for you. So a little bit of background. As you can see, my service in this assignment was for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it began in 1986. Now, this was sort of an accident in a way, because I was designated by my newspaper to go to Paris. And by a quirk of fate, the person who was supposed to go to Moscow that year could not go. And my editor called me into the office and said, "Steve, how would you like to go to Russia instead?" Now, you were all living at that time. Russia, the Soviet Union, was a huge story. Why was it a huge story? Because Mikhail Gorbachev had come into power and promised reforms. And everybody was talking about possible changes in the Soviet Union. So instead of going to Paris, where my wife, who is an attorney, could have worked, we could have lived comfortably in some wonderful apartment, in some beautiful arrondissement, and had a great time and lived a life of ease. We chose, or I chose, and thank God I married the woman I did marry because she agreed to come along. And we wound up going to Moscow instead. We also, I should mention that when we arrived in Moscow in August of 1986, my wife was, 7.5, almost 8 months pregnant with our third child. We went with 2 little girls, both under the age of 3, and a third one on the way. If you recall, this was a few months after Chernobyl, the nuclear accident in Chernobyl. And you kind of wondered what was waiting for us when we got there. Well, what was waiting for us was panic over water supplies, milk. We had to get this was one of the few times that the American embassy allowed us to use their stocks of supplies, and we were able to get milk because the milk was contaminated. The Russian milk was contaminated with radiation. Also around that time, the Russians arrested an American correspondent named Nick Danilov, who was working for US News and World Report. And basically, he was at the end of a 5-year tour, and they chose him and planted some papers on him. Now, why did they do that? Well, basically, they did that to embarrass the US, but more importantly, to use him as a trade-in for a Russian who had been arrested for spying at the United Nations. So you can imagine our mindset. I've now arrived in Moscow with my wife, 2 small kids, a pregnant wife. We can't drink the milk, we can't drink the water, and we're afraid that somebody is going to kidnap me and hold me for ransom. So, good start, don't you think? Adding to the mix was the fact that coming up in October, that October, was a big summit meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev. You probably remember it took place in Reykjavik, Iceland. And I was designated to go to that, cover that summit in Iceland. Ordinarily, maybe our correspondent based in England would have gone, but she was unavailable. Now, because having a child in a Russian hospital was a crapshoot, if I can use that language, at best, we decided to go to Finland to have our child. And with the papers agreement, we rented an apartment in Helsinki. And I was able to get there from time to time. And luckily, my wife's parents came over from the US to stay with her. But complicating matters was this upcoming summit in Reykjavik. So the summit was starting on a Wednesday. My third child, which I knew to be a son, was due on Tuesday. And the paper, I hadn't left. I was now in Helsinki with my family. And I told my editors flatly that if my son did not arrive on Tuesday, I was not going to the summit, and it was just too bad. They were not happy about that decision, but I was adamant. Anyway, my son, who's now a journalist, met his first deadline, and he arrived on Tuesday. I kissed my wife and my child goodbye and went to Iceland. And all my wife got out of it was a sweater. So anyway, back in the USSR, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. All of you know that he was a dynamic leader and is considered by many people one of the great leaders of the 20th century. At home, not so much. For the average Russian, he presided over the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so he's, oddly enough, not really well liked at home. And my first indication of just how much he was disliked was when he came into power, he decided that vodka was the root of all evil in Russia and decided to crack down on sales of vodka. It was well intended, but he wasn't reckoning on the backlash. Now you have to understand, vodka in Russia is like mother's milk. I mean, you drink it, and I had to learn how to drink it, otherwise, you know, you would be considered antisocial. And it was really a lubricant for extracting information from people. But Gorbachev's efforts to crack down on vodka sales by limiting them or raising the price backfired. In fact, all of the vodka bottles, when I got there, came with a what I would call a aluminum foil cap. So once you remove that cap, you had to finish the bottle. There was no way to. So Gorbachev quickly got the nickname of the water secretary, very derogatory. And I recall the story about a bunch of people lined up to buy vodka. And, you know, queues were sort of the way of life for everything in Russia. And this was a very, very, very long queue to buy vodka. And a guy at the back of the line said to his comrade, "I've had it. I'm going to go shoot Gorbachev." Well, you know, the guy was aghast, really. So his friend takes off, and about 15 minutes later, he comes back and he says, "No use. That line is even longer than this one." So a little bit about life in Moscow. I guess I should probably show you some pictures of what life looked like. Let's see if I can do this without. Oh, who's that good-looking guy? So this is in Red Square during one of the many parades. They had parades on the anniversary of the end of World War II, on the creation of the Soviet Union, any excuse for a parade and a assembly of dignitaries and tanks and other armaments. Now, this is at Chernobyl. As you can see, that is not a microphone. When I got back to Moscow, I had to burn all the clothes I was with. This is about 8 months after the accident. And there's my wife in Red Square. Again, another parade. It was cold. You know, when we moved to Vermont a year ago, all the Vermonters came up to me and said, "Hey, how do you like winter here?" And then I said, well, you know, the Russians, well, I lived in Russia for a while, and they have a word for what you call winter here. They call it spring. That is not my ride. That is some sort of armored vehicle that I was leaning against. This is again in Red Square, and I had a very interested observer looking at what I was writing or reading. I should say that, before I get to my family, I should say that everything we did was observed or listened to by the Russian authorities. Our house was bugged, our apartment, I should say. Our car was bugged, my office was bugged. Everything, you know, there was electronic surveillance basically everywhere. If I wanted to have a conversation, I had to go out in the courtyard or go in the bathroom and turn on the shower. Now, we didn't have any choice about where we lived. We were assigned one of the 3 compounds, which were guarded and fenced, and that's where all the foreigners lived. The community consisted of journalists, business people, and diplomats. So the reason we were guarded was not for our protection, but it was basically to keep the Russians from entering and telling us things that the Russian authorities didn't want us to hear. Now, this is, these are my 4 children. I think they're my 4 children. No, there's 3 of my children there, and I don't know who the 4th one is. But we learned to live with winter, and we were able to get around. My kids all learned to cross-country ski when they were very young. I had to bribe them with pieces of Toblerone to get them to go into another few yards. This was the courtyard. They spent more time in the courtyard. The courtyard, as I said, was guarded. This was one of the few pieces of equipment available to them. And in the background are some kids playing hockey on a makeshift ice rink. And there is my son learning to ski. I'm glad he's not here. He lives in Heinsberg because he's a very good skier now, and he probably doesn't like seeing this action photo. While I was in Moscow, a lot of famous people passed through for various reasons. Does anybody recognize this fellow? No one? Let's see, he was in Goodfellas, he was in Taxi Driver. That's right, it's Bobby De Niro. He was invited by the Russian authorities to be the judge at a film festival, and he agreed to sit for an interview with me. You can see how happy he was about that interview. Yeah, winter. This was a special event. I got to go see a joint Russian-Canadian expedition take off to ski across the North Pole. And they took a bunch of us journalists up to very lonely island called Severnaya Zemlya. I mean, I can't even tell you how many miles it was above the Arctic Circle, but it was damn close to the North Pole. This picture was taken when the temperature was 58 degrees below zero. You can probably see that my eyelashes were a little encrusted with the wind chill while it was below that. And that getup that you see me wearing is what I slept in. And when I got up to go to the bathroom, I had to be accompanied by a Russian guard with a big rifle. And when I wondered why this was so, he said, well, the polar bears will be looking for you. So I did not get up to pee after that. Okay, here's the man. Now, I happen to think he was a great leader, and I was lucky enough to get to meet him and to interview him. But as I said, he was not widely popular. This is something he said. A society should never become like a pond with stagnant water without movement. And he practiced this philosophy with his policies of glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means reconstruction. And his words and his actions and his deeds and this view of what was happening in Russia affected other parts of the communist world, none more than China. And Mao was still very much, even though he was dead, he was very much the sort of sine qua non of China. And Gorbachev was invited to visit China, and it's kind of backfired on the Russian authorities. Now, people really don't remember this, but the Tiananmen Square demonstrations and ultimately the massacre by the Chinese authorities was triggered by Gorbachev's visit to Beijing. The students gathered, demanding the same kinds of reforms that they saw being enacted in the Soviet Union. And I took this photo. You can see the police and army in the foreground and Tiananmen Square packed with people. Now, I went there with other Moscow-based journalists to cover Gorbachev's visit. When it became clear that there was quite a bit going on with the Chinese students, I asked my editors, what should I do? And they said, stay. So a number of us stayed beyond our visas, which put us in a difficult position. And Gorbachev went back to Moscow, and we stayed there to cover the demonstration. And you may remember this young man who stood in front of a tank. Let me see if I can get this to play. I guess not. Anyway, we were faced ultimately with a difficult decision. There were only a handful of us left, and we were told that if we didn't leave the next day, we would be jailed. So again, I called my editors, and they said, well, get the hell out of there. And we were actually en route back to Moscow when we heard they started shooting in Tiananmen Square. So we left. We were not witnesses, but there were Western correspondents there, of course. Now, covering Gorbachev was a little bit like, having a ticket to see the world. And this was in India, where Gorbachev went very early in his presidency, and that's his wife, Raisa. Now, I can claim that this is my intact family. One of the pleasures or privileges was to be able to travel outside of Moscow and visit different places. Although we were limited, we couldn't go anywhere we wanted. We had to get permission to go. This was in the Russian city of Suzdal, and which is beautiful for its architecture. And there's the whole gang. When I say we needed permission to go anywhere, even if you got permission, you didn't always know what you were getting into. For instance, on a number of occasions, we just wanted to go for a picnic outside of Moscow. Well, there were such things as closed areas, and they were closed to foreigners. The reasons they were closed is because there was something sensitive there. Could have been a weapons facility, a research facility, anything, but you were not supposed to go in that area. But these lines were poorly drawn, and I remember particularly a visit we went to some famous Russian author's house that was now a museum, and then we had a picnic. And no sooner had we unwrapped our food when the police rolled up and, basically put us under arrest, although they weren't taking us anywhere. But they wanted us to sign a document which was known as a protocol, which is basically an admission of guilt. And I was instructed never to sign one of these things. So how do you get out of this? Well, basically the Russians react badly to bluster. So if you argue with them long enough, they'll give up and go away. And that's what happened to us most times. Now, during my time in Moscow was when the earlier Afghanistan conflict was going on. This was the Soviets fighting the Mujahideen. And we were instructed, I can tell you not happily, but we were instructed by our editors if we had the chance to try to get to Afghanistan and report on what was going on there. And the Soviets obliged by taking groups of journalists to Afghanistan so that they could report on the conflict. And I recall our plane, as it approached Kabul, all of a sudden went into kind of a corkscrew dive. And I could see flares being dropped from our plane. And when I got on the ground, I asked one of the officials what, and they said, well, it's to avoid missiles being fired at your plane by the Mujahideen, and the flares are supposed to distract or pull away the heat-seeking missiles. But I discovered to my dismay that the flares weren't nearly hot enough to distract the missiles. So I guess we were just lucky. Now, this is me holding one of those missile launchers. Unfortunately, I was advised later that I had it backwards. So the people behind me were in big trouble. This was in Mongolia, another place we visited. I went there for where the Russian troops were being withdrawn. It was a big ceremony. And actually, it turned out to be a very fortuitous trip because I met a Mongolian official who was supposed to keep an eye on us, and he later became a friend and wound up being in the embassy in Moscow. So you found journalistic sources wherever you could. Now, as a correspondent, and I'm not saying this because it's sour grapes or anything, but I was a one-man bureau trying to cover 1/6 of the Earth's surface. My fellow correspondents for the New York Times, Washington Post, had much larger news organizations. So my mission was not really to try to match their stories. I looked for stories that I could make my own, and that were, good stories, but they weren't necessarily the news of the day. And one of the most interesting places I had to go or wanted to go were the Baltic republics, because the Baltics, and by that I mean Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were as Western as any of the 15 Soviet republics could be, and very anti-Russian, yearning for independence. Now, this photograph is of a young girl and her grandmother, and it was taken in Estonia by me. And the young girl was essentially being held hostage by the Russian authorities. Why? Because her parents had defected to Sweden. And they assumed, incorrectly as it turned out, that they would be able to get their daughter out. Who would keep a 3-year-old daughter in captivity once the parents were out of the country? But they underestimated the Russian authorities, who really didn't give a fig for any kind of familial reconciliation. And I came across this story and wrote an article about it, which got a lot of attention. And I'm happy to say that as a result of the story I wrote, the girl was repatriated with her parents in Sweden. And that was something I was actually very proud of. Now, back to famous people passing through Moscow. Who knows who this is? There we go. We do have some boxing fans here. So this is Iron Mike Tyson. And what was he doing in Moscow? Well, he was the boyfriend of an actress named Robin Givens at the time. And Robin was filming a TV show in Moscow. And they were estranged. And Mike thought by coming to Moscow, he could win her back. And I knew when I got wind of the fact that Mike was in Red Square that he would be mobbed by people, and he would probably avoid talking to just about anybody. So I thought, well, what will get him to talk to me? Now, Mike, like myself, is originally from New York. No booze, please. Mike, like myself, is a New York Yankee fan. No booze, please. And so I wore my Yankee hat to Red Square, and Mike immediately picked me out of the crowd, and I wound up having a long conversation with him, and in fact took him into Lenin's tomb, where he was just gobsmacked that this was really Lenin. We had quite a spirited conversation about that. Mike later put me, I don't have a photograph of it, but Mike later put me in a headlock, a playful headlock, but when Mike Tyson puts you in a headlock, it really isn't playful. Now, this gentleman, hopefully, is a little more recognizable to you all. Now, Mr. Rogers was invited to Moscow in an exchange program because his program, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, had an exchange with a children's program in Russia called Spokony Nochi, which was watched by every Russian and, in fact, a lot of foreign kids. It meant good night, children. So Mr. Rogers came for a visit and went to my one of my daughter's nursery school and enchanted the children there. And because I was representing the Philadelphia Inquirer and Mr. Rogers is from Pittsburgh, I was able to arrange an interview with him. And my wife drove him over, ferried him over. She got the job of taking all the famous people around. And she can tell you about her experience being Robert Redford's chauffeur. And Mr. Rogers came to my office, and here I am brewing tea for him. And I have to tell you that Mr. Rogers was every bit as nice as you would think from seeing him on television. And it was a real privilege and a pleasure to be in his company. So my children went to school. There was a school called the Anglo-American School, which, from the name, as it implies, was founded by the US and British embassies. But any foreign, any expatriate child who was there, who was from a family of diplomats or journalists or businessmen, could go to the school. And my kids, my two older kids, have very fond memories of the Anglo-American School, and to this day have friends they keep in touch with. Whoops. I think I skipped one. Well, this is the present-day family. This is taken at Shelburne Beach, and you can see they've multiplied. So some things I didn't cover in the slides. Apart from being listened to at every juncture, we were also harassed by the local police, primarily when we were driving around. And the GAI, as the acronym of the Moscow police, would stop you and for no reason. I mean, they just stop you and they would expect a bribe. So you either paid the money and went on your way, or you argued with them. Some of us discovered that if we said in Russian, "I don't understand," and kept on saying that long enough, the GAI would give up and let us go. So we learned to say, "Я не понимаю," which means "I don't understand." One of my colleagues who was less acquainted with the Russian language, unfortunately said, "Я не понедельник," which translated means "I'm not Monday." The cop was not amused and extracted the full toll for making him feel stupid. The other thing I should get into, although it's somewhat a delicate matter, is not only we were spied upon and harassed in different ways, but the Russians also had something they called, or which became known as honey traps. Does anybody know what a honey trap is? It has nothing to do with bees, but it has everything to do with the birds and the bees. The Russians would, actually the term was coined by the late great spy writer John le Carré, and referred to the Russian practice of dangling a person of the opposite sex, attractive person in the opposite sex in your vicinity to compromise you. Now, why would they want to compromise you? Well, if they took embarrassing photos of you, they could do various things. They could blackmail you and try to get you to provide information that they were seeking, hoping that the idea that exposure of your dalliance would so embarrass you that you would be forced to comply. The other reason they did it is if they didn't like what you were writing and they simply wanted you out of the country. So they would compromise you and then force you to be recalled by your newspaper. And I fortunately escaped a very crafty honey trap, which was set for me by a trip when I went on a trip to Armenia, and it was to interview some dissidents. Now, I couldn't travel by myself, so they sent somebody from the Russian Foreign Ministry with me, who was reporting to the KGB. And in one of my stops in Armenia, we went to an artist colony outside of Yerevan in a place called Dilijan. And I was interviewing an artist with my minder with me. And it was a good interview, and we were invited to stay for dinner. And during dinner, our host invited a very attractive young lady who sat next to me and seemed to get closer and closer, practically on top of me. And then after dinner, of course, we were drinking during dinner. And then after dinner, we were invited to go for a swim. Lo and behold, there was an underground pool in this housing complex. And since we didn't have bathing suits, we were au natural. And anyway, the water got kind of warm. And we dried off and resumed drinking. And fortunately, one of the few times in my life my short temper paid off. I got into an argument with somebody else in the group who was with the artist, a Russian, Armenian, and it was a political argument, and we were screaming at each other, and as a result, the party broke up. We left and said goodbye to my companion, and sheepishly, my foreign ministry minder came to me the next morning, both of us sporting big hangovers, and confessed that this was a honey trap and he was going to get severely disciplined because he had failed in his mission. Well, I had a certain amount of sympathy for him, but not a lot, since it would have cost me quite a bit. Well, anyway, we went to say goodbye to our host, and the host graciously presented me with one of his paintings, which happened to be of my dining and swimming companion. So let's see. I think I've nattered on long enough, and I think I should give you a chance to ask some questions if you have some. So please raise your hand, and as I said, I will call on you or ignore you. Yes, John.
Is Gorbachev buried on the wall in the Red Square?
Actually, he is not buried anywhere. He's, I think, 87 years old and still around. Yeah. And I think he's still living in Moscow. Occasionally surfaces. Yes, sir.
Curious about the bribes that get you to be on your way and shot by the police. What amount of money would be required to get you free?
Well, that's a good question because it depends on what money you were using. Now, they would expect rubles, and if you gave them dollars, you would actually be doing yourself a disservice because then they would mark you down as somebody who had foreign currency, and you get stopped more often than anybody else because foreign currency was like gold. It enabled you to shop in the stores that they couldn't shop in. So, you know, there was no going rate, but, you know, if you gave them a 10 or 20 ruble note, they would let you go. They didn't really quibble about it. Now, I should say, currency was an interesting issue in Moscow because there was the official line on what the value of the ruble was worth. Let's say it was worth 4 to $1. But on a black market, you could get, for $1, you could probably get 500 rubles because they were not considered very. So a number of people, mostly diplomats, participated in the black market and you know, financed their embassies that way because they got huge value in rubles in return for dollars. But it didn't always work out too well. I remember I should probably not mention the news organization, but they sold one of their cars to an African diplomat for, you know, something like 300,000 rubles. And of course, that enabled the correspondent to pay all their Russian staff, and it was a big windfall. Unfortunately for that news organization, that car was later used in a bombing in Africa and was traced back to that news organization. So next question, please. Nobody has a question?
Last call.
Well, I'll ask myself a question. Steve, what was the nature of the camaraderie among the journalists when you were there? Well, when I was there, we were a relatively small group. You know, 10 years later, 15 years later, the number of correspondents in Moscow, as things opened up and more businesses opened up, doubled and tripled and quadrupled. But when I was there, it was a relatively small journalistic community, and which was both good and bad, because it meant that you knew everybody, mostly you shared information, you helped one another, but it also meant that you knew everything about everybody else, just like any small town. And the KGB liked to take advantage of this, and another way they would sow dissent would be to reveal sort of some of the secret dalliances that were going on. The community was composed of men and women, most of whom were both journalists. I was in a rare group where my wife was not a journalist, but most journalistic couples who were there, both were journalists working for either the same organization or different organizations. And the KGB would try to sow domestic dissent. And in one case, one memorable case, where a prominent journalist was having an affair with another journalist in a different news organization, the KGB crudely painted words to that effect in the elevator of the correspondent's wife's apartment. And as you can imagine, that was not a happy occasion. And again, this was a case of the Russians making mischief with us. I'm sorry, somebody started to raise their hand. Yes, ma'am.
I just was wondering what opportunities there may have been for you and your family to attend, like ballet or any of the other.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. In fact, that was one of the great privileges or luxuries we had. You all know how great the ballet and to a lesser extent the opera. Well, we could easily get tickets for very little money to the Bolshoi, and that was wonderful to be able to take advantage of that. And I remember particularly, I'm kind of an opera buff, and there was an exchange while I was there between La Scala and the Russian opera company, which, La Scala was great. Russian opera was not up to the level of the ballet. So the La Scala came, and I got to cover it because the conductor of La Scala at that time was Riccardo Muti, who was also the conductor of the in Philadelphia part of the time. And so I got to see every performance. I think there were about 6 that Muti led. And the first couple of performances, very strangely, the Russian audiences were very attentive, very polite, but they were making noise while Muti was conducting. And Muti did not like this and kept on turning around with his leonine head and staring and glaring at the audience. And after the second performance, I was up in Muti's office, and he was grumbling about this, and his Russian interpreter said, "Maestro, the reason they're making noise is because you keep turning around and they want to see you. If you stop turning around, they'll be quiet." And in fact, that's exactly what happened.
So most ordinary Russian people would be able to afford, at that point in time in their economy?
No. It wasn't, no, the tickets would be both, for the average Russian, it was not so much the cost, although the cost to them was higher than the cost to us, because we were paying foreign currency. But the average Russian, their problem was access. They were very low on the totem pole of being able to have the privilege to purchase tickets. It wasn't just walking up to the box office and saying, "Give me 2 on the aisle in row D." Didn't happen that way. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
mentioned traveling to Iceland and other locations outside of Russia. How were those arrangements made? Did you have to make your own reservations and pay for them out of your pocket, or?
Well, mostly, yes, I had to make my own reservations. And I either put them on an expense sheet and submitted them to my newspaper, or the travel agent that worked for the newspaper was able to make the arrangements, and I was able to. But occasionally, things, you know, I had to do things ad hoc. And one memorable expense, which probably didn't go down too well with my newspapers, was Gorbachev was going to Rome to meet the Pope, and then he was traveling on to yet another summit meeting, this one on a ship in Malta with George H.W. Bush. And so the meeting, we got sent to Rome, that was fine. And we then had to get to Malta very quickly. Well, you know, that is not an easy trip. So myself and two other correspondents rented a private jet, and I don't remember what it cost, but I can imagine what the bean counters back in Philadelphia thought when they saw that expense account. Anybody else? Well, thank you all. You've been a great audience, and thank you.